Margaret Chen pushed through the glass doors of Morrison & Associates accounting firm on a cold Monday morning in November. Her navy blue cardigan was buttoned all the way up, and she carried a simple black purse that had seen better days. At 52, she moved quietly through the modern office lobby, her soft-soled shoes making barely a sound on the polished floors. This was her third week at the job, and she was still getting used to the bustling energy around her. Young professionals hurried past with their coffee cups and smartphones, discussing weekend plans and office gossip in voices that carried across the open workspace. Margaret found an empty desk in the data entry department and began organizing her few personal items: a small succulent plant, a basic calculator, and a photo of her elderly mother. The accounting firm was nothing like the places she used to work. Everything here was sleek and modern, with glass conference rooms and motivational posters about teamwork and success. The employees were mostly in their 20s and 30s, dressed in trendy business casual outfits that probably cost more than Margaret spent on clothes in 6 months. "Good morning," she said quietly to her desk neighbor, a woman named Kelly, who was busy typing while sipping an elaborate coffee drink with foam art on top. Kelly glanced up briefly and gave a polite smile. "Oh, hi, Margaret. How's it going?" "Fine, thank you," Margaret replied, settling into her chair. She noticed Kelly's desk was decorated with photos from exotic vacations and expensive restaurant meals. There were pictures from wine tastings, cooking classes, and trendy food festivals. As the morning progressed, Margaret focused on her work, entering invoice data and updating client files. The job was simple and predictable, which was exactly what she wanted. No stress, no pressure, just quiet work that let her mind rest. Around 10 o'clock, the morning coffee break began. The younger employees gathered near the kitchen area, discussing their weekend adventures with animated gestures and loud laughter. "You guys have to try that new fusion restaurant downtown," said Jessica, a marketing coordinator who seemed to be the unofficial food expert of the office. She was always talking about the latest restaurants and food trends. "The chef trained in Japan and France. The flavors are absolutely incredible." Tom from the sales department nodded enthusiastically. "I saw your Instagram post. That dessert looked amazing. I tried to get reservations, but they're booked for months. You have to know someone to get in," Jessica said with obvious pride. "Luckily, my boyfriend knows the manager." Margaret listened to their conversation while quietly eating a peanut butter sandwich she had brought from home. She noticed how the group's discussions always centered around expensive restaurants, craft cocktails, and exclusive food experiences. They spoke about cuisine like experts, using terms like umami and molecular gastronomy with confidence. "What about you, Margaret?" Kelly asked, apparently noticing her sitting alone. "Do you have any favorite restaurants?" Margaret looked up, surprised to be included. "Oh, I usually eat at home," she said simply. The group exchanged glances that they thought Margaret didn't notice. Jessica's expression was a mixture of pity and slight condescension. "That's nice," Jessica said in the tone people use when they're trying to be polite but don't really understand. "Home cooking can be comforting." Margaret nodded and took another bite of her sandwich. She didn't mention that she preferred eating at home, or that she found most restaurant food disappointing. Instead, she listened as the conversation moved on to weekend plans and upcoming food festivals. Over the following days, Margaret began to understand the office social hierarchy. Jessica was clearly the leader when it came to anything food-related. She organized group lunches at trendy spots and was always the first to hear about new restaurant openings. Her desk drawers were stocked with expensive imported chocolates and artisanal snacks. Tom was Jessica's eager follower, always agreeing with her recommendations and trying to one-up others with stories about exclusive dining experiences. He had a habit of photographing his meals and posting them online with detailed captions about flavor profiles and presentation. Kelly was friendly, but busy, more interested in her work than office politics. She occasionally joined the foodie discussions but preferred to listen rather than compete for attention. Then there was David, the quiet guy from IT who brought the same ham sandwich every day and seemed perfectly content with it. Margaret found his consistency refreshing, though she noticed the others sometimes made gentle jokes about his boring lunch choices. The office manager, Linda, was a practical woman in her 40s who focused more on getting work done than discussing restaurants. She was polite to everyone but didn't participate much in the social conversations. As Margaret settled into her routine, she realized that her coworkers had formed definite opinions about her. They saw her as a nice but unremarkable middle-aged woman who probably lived a simple, predictable life. When lunch conversations turned to exotic cuisines or expensive restaurants, they would automatically assume she wouldn't be interested or couldn't afford such places. Margaret didn't mind their assumptions. In fact, she found them somewhat amusing. She had spent decades in environments where people judged each other constantly, and this office was refreshingly free from that kind of pressure. Here, she could just be another quiet employee doing her job well and going home at the end of the day. During her lunch breaks, Margaret often walked to a nearby park where she could sit peacefully and watch people pass by. Sometimes she would stop at a simple deli for soup or a salad, but she was always back at her desk on time, ready to continue her work without any fanfare. The November days grew shorter, and the office began buzzing with talk about the upcoming holiday party. Margaret learned that it was an annual tradition, a big event where the company invited important clients and celebrated the year's successes. The planning committee was already forming, with Jessica naturally taking a leadership role. "We need to make this year special," Jessica announced during one of the coffee breaks. "Last year's party was good, but I think we can do better." Margaret watched from her desk as the enthusiastic group gathered around Jessica, discussing themes and decorations and catering options. Their energy was infectious, and even employees who usually kept to themselves seemed interested in contributing ideas. That's when Margaret made a decision that would surprise everyone, including herself. She quietly approached the group during their next planning meeting. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I was wondering if I could help with anything." The group turned to look at her with friendly but slightly surprised expressions. Jessica smiled warmly. "Of course, Margaret. We'd love to have your help. What kind of thing were you thinking?" Margaret looked around at the eager faces. "Well, I could help with decorations, or maybe I could make some food." The suggestion hung in the air for a moment, and Margaret could sense the group's hesitation. They were clearly trying to be polite while figuring out how to handle this unexpected offer from someone they considered sweet but probably not up to their sophisticated standards. What Margaret didn't know was that this simple offer would soon turn her quiet, life upside down, and teach her coworkers a lesson they would never forget. The next morning, Margaret arrived at work to find the holiday party planning committee in full swing. Jessica had claimed the large conference room and spread papers across the table like a military operation. Color swatches, vendor brochures, and budget spreadsheets covered every surface. "Okay, everyone, we have exactly 3 weeks to pull this together," Jessica announced to the gathered volunteers. "This year we're going for elegant sophistication. Think upscale restaurant vibes, not office party." Margaret quietly took a seat at the edge of the group, her hands folded in her lap. She had volunteered to help the day before, and Jessica had assigned her to the decorations committee, what everyone considered the safest job for someone with uncertain taste. Tom was already deep into catering research, his laptop screen showing fancy restaurant websites. "I've been looking at these upscale places downtown. The prices are pretty steep, but the food looks incredible." "Price isn't everything," Jessica said, though Margaret noticed her checking the budget sheet nervously. "Our clients expect quality. We can't serve them grocery store sheet cake and call it sophisticated." Kelly raised her hand tentatively. "What about that place on 5th Street? They do corporate events and the prices seem more reasonable." Jessica wrinkled her nose. "I checked them out. Very basic stuff. Sandwich platters and fruit trays. That's not the impression we want to make." Margaret listened as the group debated various catering options. Each suggestion seemed to be either too expensive or not fancy enough to meet Jessica's standards. The tension in the room was growing as they realized their vision might be bigger than their budget. "What if we did a mix?" suggested David from IT, who had wandered in during his lunch break. "Maybe get the main course catered and supplement with other things." "Like what other things?" Jessica asked, her tone suggesting this wasn't going to work either. "Well," David shrugged, "some of us could bring homemade stuff. Desserts or appetizers or whatever." The room fell silent. Jessica's expression made it clear what she thought of this idea. "David, I appreciate the creativity, but free talking about important clients here. This isn't a potluck dinner at church. We need professional quality food that represents our company's image." Margaret cleared her throat softly. "I could make some desserts." Everyone turned to look at her. For a moment, the room was completely quiet except for the humming of the air conditioning. Jessica's face went through several expressions before settling on polite concern. "Oh, Margaret, that's so sweet of you to offer. But like I said, we really need restaurant-quality food for this event." "I understand," Margaret said quietly. "I just thought maybe I could help." Tom leaned back in his chair with a grin that wasn't entirely kind. "What kind of desserts were you thinking, Margaret?" "Chocolate chip cookies? Maybe a nice banana bread?" A few people chuckled, and Margaret felt her cheeks warm slightly. She had expected this reaction, but it still stung a little. "I was thinking maybe something a bit more elaborate," she said carefully. Jessica's eyebrows went up. "Elaborate how?" Margaret hesitated, knowing that anything she said would probably sound ridiculous to this group. "Well, I could make some pastries, or maybe a cake." The laughter started small, just a snort from Tom, but it quickly spread around the table. Jessica tried to maintain her composure, but even she was fighting a smile. "Margaret," Jessica said in the tone people use when explaining something to a child, "I think you're underestimating what we need here. We're talking about French pastries, gourmet desserts, things that could compete with high-end restaurants. It's not just about following a recipe from a cookbook." "I know," Margaret said simply. "Do you, though?" Tom jumped in, clearly enjoying himself now. "Because no offense, but I've seen your lunches. Peanut butter sandwiches and apple slices aren't exactly gourmet cuisine." More laughter rippled through the group. Margaret noticed that Kelly looked uncomfortable with the direction this was taking, but she didn't speak up. Jessica held up her hand to quiet the group, though she was still smiling. "Look, Margaret, we all appreciate your enthusiasm, and I'm sure you make lovely desserts for your family. But this is a professional event with some very important people attending. We need food that's going to impress them." "What Jessica's trying to say," Tom added helpfully, "is that this might be a little out of your league. No shame in that. We all have our strengths." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand what you're saying." "Great," Jessica said, clearly relieved to have handled this diplomatically. "So let's get back to researching caterers. Tom, can you call those 3 places we discussed and get detailed quotes?" As the meeting continued, Margaret remained quiet in her chair. She watched the group struggle with the reality that professional catering was going to eat up most of their budget, leaving little money for decorations or anything else. The stress was showing on Jessica's face as she realized her grand vision might not be achievable. "Okay, new plan," Jessica announced after an hour of frustrating phone calls. "We'll have to scale back. Maybe just appetizers and drinks, skip the fancy desserts entirely." "That seems kind of sad for a holiday party," Kelly ventured. "It's better than serving amateur hour food," Tom said. Glancing meaningfully at Margaret, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't anger exactly, but something deeper and more resolved. She had been content to let them underestimate her, even found it amusing. But their casual cruelty was starting to cross a line. "Well," she said quietly, "if you change your mind about the desserts, just let me know." Jessica gave her an indulgent smile. "That's very sweet, Margaret, but I think we've got it covered." The meeting ended with a long list of compromises and a growing sense that this year's party might not live up to expectations. As people filed out of the conference room, Margaret heard Tom whisper to Jessica, "Can you imagine what Margaret's elaborate pastries would look like?" "Probably store-bought cookies arranged on a nice plate." Jessica giggled. "Stop it. She's trying to help. By offering to bake cookies for a professional event? Come on, Jessica. You did the right thing shutting that down." Margaret packed up her notebook slowly, letting the others leave first. She had volunteered to help with good intentions, and instead had become the subject of office jokes. Part of her wanted to forget the whole thing and just focus on her decorations assignment, but another part of her, a part that had been quiet for too long, was beginning to stir. That evening, Margaret sat in her small apartment thinking about the day's events. She looked around at her modest surroundings, the simple furniture, the few personal belongings, the kitchen that most people would consider ordinary. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found a number she hadn't called in months. Her finger hovered over the screen for a moment before she made the call. "Hello, Antoine? It's Margaret. I know it's been a while, but I need a favor." The conversation that followed would change everything, though her coworkers wouldn't know it until it was far too late. Margaret hung up the phone and sat quietly in her living room for a moment. The conversation with Antoine had been brief but productive. After 15 years of friendship, he understood exactly what she needed without requiring many explanations. "Of course, Margaret," he had said in his familiar French accent. "I'll have everything delivered to your apartment by Thursday. But are you sure about this? You said you wanted a quiet life." "I do want a quiet life," Margaret had replied, "but sometimes quiet people need to make a point." Now 2 days later, Margaret was looking at her apartment with new eyes. She had lived here for 6 months, carefully maintaining the appearance of a simple woman living a simple life. But tonight, that was going to change. The first delivery arrived at 8 in the morning on Thursday. Margaret opened her door to find a professional equipment rental company standing in the hallway with several large boxes. "Margaret Chen?" the delivery man asked, checking his clipboard. "That's me. We've got a commercial stand mixer, precision scale, 3 convection ovens, and a bunch of other stuff. Where do you want everything?" Margaret guided them through her apartment, watching as her modest living space transformed. The rental company efficiently set up a temporary professional kitchen that would have made any restaurant jealous. The stand mixer alone was worth more than most people's cars. Her neighbors, Mrs. Patterson from next door, peeked out to see what was happening. "Goodness, Margaret, are you starting a catering business?" she asked with curiosity. Margaret smiled. "Just doing some baking for a work event." Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened as she saw another delivery truck pulling up. "That's quite a lot of equipment for office cookies." "Yes," Margaret said simply. "It is." The second delivery was even more impressive. Professional-grade ingredients that most home bakers had never heard of arrived in temperature-controlled containers. Madagascar vanilla beans, Belgian chocolate, French butter, specialized flours from Italy, and exotic spices from around the world filled Margaret's refrigerator and pantry. Meanwhile, at the office, the holiday party planning was becoming a disaster. Jessica sat at her desk with her head in her hands, surrounded by rejected catering quotes and vendor contracts that had fallen through. The fancy restaurant she had finally chosen had just called to cancel, claiming they were overbooked. "This is a nightmare," she told Tom, who was equally stressed. "The party is in 5 days and we have no food. What about that backup place on 5th Street? Tom suggested. I called them. They're booked too. Apparently December is a busy month for caterers, who knew? Kelly overheard the conversation from her desk. "Did you try asking Margaret again about the desserts? At least that would be something." Jessica and Tom exchanged looks. "Kelly, we've been over this," Jessica said patiently. "We need professional quality food. Margaret is sweet, but she's not a professional chef." "But if we're desperate," Kelly started. "We're not that desperate," Tom interrupted. Yet, while her coworkers panicked, Margaret was in her apartment working with the focused intensity of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She had changed into professional chef's whites that fit her perfectly, and her entire demeanor had shifted. Gone was the quiet, uncertain woman from the office. In her place stood someone who moved through the kitchen with absolute confidence and precision. Every motion was deliberate, every measurement exact. She started with the chocolate work, tempering Belgian dark chocolate to create delicate sculptures that would serve as centerpieces. Her hands moved quickly and surely, shaping the warm chocolate into intricate designs that looked more like art than food. Next came the pastry dough for croissants and pain au chocolat. Margaret's technique was flawless as she folded and rolled the butter into the dough, creating the perfect layers that would result in impossibly flaky pastries. The macaron shells were next, requiring perfect timing and temperature control. Margaret whipped the egg whites to exact peaks, folded in the almond flour with practiced precision, and piped perfect circles onto silicone mats. Each batch went into the convection ovens at precisely timed intervals. As she worked, Margaret's phone buzzed with text messages from Antoine. "The specialty molds arrived safely?" "Yes, thank you." "And the gold leaf?" "Perfect condition." "You know this is going to cause quite a stir." Margaret paused in her piping to respond. "That's the idea." By Friday morning, Margaret's apartment looked like a high-end patisserie. Cooling racks filled every surface, holding creations that belonged in the windows of expensive bakeries. The smell was incredible. Rich chocolate, buttery pastry, and delicate spices filled the air. She had created architectural sugar sculptures that defied gravity, hand-painted macarons in colors that didn't exist in nature, and chocolate bonbons filled with exotic flavor combinations that most people had never imagined. There were eclairs topped with edible flowers, croissants shaped like works of art, and a centerpiece cake that looked like it belonged in a museum. At the office, the crisis was reaching its peak. Jessica had spent the morning calling every caterer within 50 miles, only to be told that December bookings were impossible on such short notice. "Maybe we should just cancel the whole thing," she said to Linda. "The office manager." "We can't cancel," Linda replied firmly. "We've already invited the clients. This party is important for business relationships." "Then what do you suggest? Order pizza?" Linda was quiet for a moment. "What about Margaret's offer?" Jessica stared at her. "You can't be serious, and I'm completely serious. She offered to help, and right now she's our only option." "Linda, I've seen Margaret's lunches. Peanut butter sandwiches and carrot sticks. Do you really think she can handle desserts for 50 people? I think we're out of other choices," Linda said practically. "At least ask her. The worst she can say is no." Jessica reluctantly walked over to Margaret's desk where the quiet woman was typing steadily, apparently unaware of the chaos around her. "Margaret?" Jessica said, her voice strained with stress and desperation. Margaret looked up with the same mild expression she always wore. "Yes? About your offer to make desserts. Is that still on the table?" Margaret was quiet for a moment, as if considering the question seriously. "You said you needed professional quality food." "Well, yes, but..." Jessica struggled to find the right words. "Our situation has changed. We're having some catering issues." "I see," Margaret said simply. "And now you're thinking my amateur desserts might be better than nothing?" Jessica's face flushed. When Margaret put it that way, it sounded terrible. "That's not how I meant it," Jessica said quickly. Margaret saved her file and turned to face Jessica completely. "What exactly are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you would be willing to make desserts for the party. Professional quality desserts. For 50 people. By Monday." Margaret was quiet for so long that Jessica started to think she was going to say no. Finally, Margaret nodded slowly. "I can do that," she said. Jessica felt a wave of relief wash over her. "Really, you're sure?" "I'm sure. But I'll need to handle the delivery myself. And I'll need you to trust me on the presentation." "Of course, whatever you need. Thank you so much, Margaret. You're really saving us here." Margaret turned back to her computer. "Don't thank me yet," she said quietly. "Wait until you see what I bring." As Jessica walked away, she had no idea that Margaret was already mentally planning the most elaborate dessert display the office had ever seen. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with snow threatening in the December sky. Margaret walked into the office carrying only a small white bakery box, the same modest container she brought her simple lunches in every day. Her co-workers barely glanced at her as she settled at her desk and began her usual routine. Jessica was already in panic mode, checking her watch every few minutes and looking toward the conference room where the holiday party would begin at 11 o'clock. The room looked elegant with the decorations committee's work, but it felt empty without the promised desserts. "Margaret," Jessica called out, trying to keep her voice calm. "How are those desserts coming along?" Margaret looked up from her computer screen. "They'll be here soon." "Soon?" Jessica's voice cracked slightly. "The party starts in 2 hours. Shouldn't they be here already?" "The delivery truck should arrive any minute," Margaret said with the same quiet confidence she always showed. Tom overheard the conversation and wandered over. "Delivery truck? Margaret, how many desserts did you make?" "Enough," Margaret replied simply, returning to her typing. Jessica and Tom exchanged worried glances. They had both been imagining Margaret showing up with a few homemade cookies or maybe a simple cake. The mention of a delivery truck was concerning. "Margaret," Jessica said carefully, "please tell me you didn't spend a lot of your own money on this. We can reimburse you for basic ingredients, but we can't afford anything too expensive." Margaret paused her typing and looked at Jessica with an expression that was hard to read. "Don't worry about the cost." Before Jessica could ask what that meant, Linda's voice echoed through the office from the reception area. "There's a delivery truck outside asking for Margaret Chen. A really big delivery truck." Everyone in the office looked up from their work. Margaret calmly saved her file and stood up. "That would be mine," she said, walking toward the elevator. Jessica hurried after her, with Tom and several other curious co-workers following behind. They crowded into the elevator, all trying to peer out the windows as they descended to the ground floor. In the parking lot sat a refrigerated catering truck that belonged to one of the city's most expensive gourmet food companies. Two men in professional uniforms were unloading equipment and covered trays with the efficiency of people who did this for a living. "Excuse me," Jessica called out to them. "Are you looking for Margaret Chen?" "Yes, ma'am. We have a special delivery for Miss Chen. Is she here?" Margaret stepped forward. "I'm Margaret." The delivery supervisor checked his clipboard and smiled respectfully. "Good morning, Ms. Chen. We have everything ready as requested. Should we set up in the conference room as discussed?" "Yes, please," Margaret said. "Just follow the building directory." Jessica watched in amazement as the uniformed men began wheeling in professional catering equipment and elegant display stands. This wasn't someone dropping off homemade cookies. This was the kind of delivery she'd seen at high-end corporate events and wedding receptions. "Margaret," Jessica whispered urgently, "this looks incredibly expensive. How much did this cost?" "Let's go upstairs and see," Margaret said calmly. The elevator ride back up was silent except for the quiet hum of the machinery. Jessica's mind was racing with questions, but Margaret's serene expression gave nothing away. When they reached the conference room, the transformation was already beginning. The delivery team worked with practiced precision, setting up tiered display stands and adjusting lighting to showcase whatever was hidden under those pristine white covers. "If everyone could step back, please," the supervisor said politely. "We need some space to arrange everything properly." The growing crowd of office workers pressed against the glass walls of the conference room, watching through the windows as the setup continued. Margaret stood calmly beside Jessica, seemingly unbothered by all the attention. "Margaret," Tom said, his voice tight with anxiety, "this is looking pretty elaborate. Are you sure you know what you're doing?" "I'm sure," Margaret replied. Finally, the supervisor approached Margaret with a tablet for her signature. "Everything is set up according to your specifications, Ms. Chen. Should we proceed with the reveal?" Margaret nodded. "Please." With theatrical precision, the delivery team began removing the white covers from the displays. The reaction was immediate and stunned. Where everyone had expected simple homemade desserts, they found creations that belonged in the finest restaurants in the world. Towering croquembouches spiraled upward like architectural marvels. Delicate macarons in impossible colors were arranged in perfect geometric patterns. Chocolate sculptures that looked more like modern art than food served as stunning centerpieces. There were eclairs topped with edible gold leaf, tarts that looked like stained glass windows, and petit fours decorated with hand-painted designs. Each creation was more elaborate than the last, and the overall effect was breathtaking. Jessica's mouth fell open. She had organized dozens of corporate events, but she had never seen a dessert display this sophisticated. It looked like something from a royal wedding or a celebrity gala. "This is impossible," Tom whispered, pressing closer to the glass. "Where did these come from?" The delivery supervisor overheard him and smiled. "These are all original creations by Miss Chen. She's quite talented." "Original creations?" Jessica repeated faintly. "Margaret made all of this?" "Every piece," the supervisor confirmed. "We just provided delivery and setup services. The artistry is all hers." The office had gone completely quiet. Even people who had been working at their desks were now crowded around the conference room, staring at the incredible display inside. Margaret remained calm in the center of the chaos, but there was something different about her posture now. She stood straighter, more confident, as if a mask was slowly falling away. "Margaret," Kelly said in an awed voice, "how did you learn to make things like this?" Before Margaret could answer, the delivery supervisor reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I almost forgot," he said, handing it to Margaret. "This arrived at our facility addressed to you." Margaret opened the envelope and read the card inside. A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Is it something important?" Jessica asked, still trying to process what she was seeing. Margaret looked around at the crowd of faces staring at her expectantly. For the first time since starting work at the accounting firm, she had Sika nodded, understanding now that Margaret's quiet months in the office hadn't been about hiding her talents. They had been about healing and rediscovering her love for her craft on her own terms. The simple woman who had been told to bake as a joke had taught them all that true skill speaks for itself, and that respect should never have to be earned through assumptions about appearance or background. Margaret had found her way back to the kitchen, But more importantly, she had found her way back to herself.